Welcome to everybody. We've got a big topic today, so we're going to start with some pretty big questions. So first question goes to Sarah. And my question for you, Sarah, is why is climate change an issue for workers?
Well, thanks, Lauren. And first of all, I just want to say thank you so much to the Kamenovitz Institute or initiative and the work of Joe McCartan and Lane Wyndham to bring us all together. These are really important discussions if we're going to get this right. So as flight attendants, we can tell you how it affects our jobs. And many people who would like to just sort of gloss over the Green New Deal, or we heard a lot of things about when the Green New Deal was introduced, that this was going to be a job killer. And what I have to tell you is that as we have had increased climate disruptions, extreme weather events, we have seen an increase in clear air turbulence, for example. So this is a major hazard in our workplace where flight attendants and carts have been thrown around the cabin, sometimes on top of passengers or other people getting hurt, and it can actually be work-ending injuries. And so that is an issue, but we've also had aircraft that have to stay on the ground because the tarmac is too hot, or we've had infrastructure at airports be destroyed in these extreme events. So it's really important for us to understand that the solutions to climate change is not the job killer. Climate change itself is the job killer. And this is step number one, is defining the problem so that we can set our demands as workers and make a difference. This is why we are engaged. This is why the Association of Flight Attendants was the first union to endorse the Green New Deal. And I'm happy to be involved in this discussion because our jobs are going to continue to be affected. We're going to continue to be squeezed. And the great labor organizer, Mother Jones, told us over 100 years ago when she was fighting against child labor. She said, the capitalists say there is no need of labor organizing, except that they themselves are always organizing and showing their real beliefs. And the truth is that the corporate elite are looking for the next crisis to squeeze more and more control, more and more of our work. So if we are not having these discussions and setting the agenda and moving our world forward in a positive way for working people, we are going to find that we've been squeezed harder than ever before because we'll be willing to agree to anything just so that we can breathe. That's not where we want to get to. That's why we're engaged in this discussion, and it's affecting us right now in our workplace.
And, you know, in the last few years, we've started talking about the Green New Deal. Is an idea that's come up and gained a lot of popularity, and that obviously draws on the original New Deal. So I'm going to turn it over to our historian, Samir. Samir, could you talk with us a little bit about how is the experience of the New Deal still relevant today?
Sure. Yeah, Lauren, I mean, just before I get into it, thanks again, Lauren, for coordinating this, and KI. I mean, what an extraordinary set of events. And I feel really blessed to be here with two, I mean, again, towering figures, Catherine and Sarah. I'm going to learn a lot from this conversation myself. It's an important question to ask. Like, why is this thing that happened a century ago at this point, or almost a century ago, still looming so large in our political imagination about what is to be done, to the point that progressive policymakers turn to it and naming the signature policy for the biggest issue confronting us today. And yeah, I think, I mean, the short answer is it's relevant because it was the last time, really, maybe with a little bit of an exception in the 60s, but the last big time that progressives succeeded at affecting real structural change in the political economy. And I mean, that's a little sad, right, that it was that long ago, and that's all we've got to draw on. But it is what it is. That's we don't choose our conditions. We make history under whatever we inherit. I mean, I think I would say, to kind of flesh that out a little bit, maybe two things that are particularly relevant and maybe useful for us. One is that, the New Deal, we talk about it as if it's a thing, but it wasn't, one thing. It was a lot of different things, a lot of different policies and programs with a million different acronyms that maybe some people remember from high school. And it was a coalition that was more often in conflict with one another internally than on the same page about things. And so I think that's an important kind of thing to recognize in when we talk about what this thing called the New Deal was. And so I would say maybe most useful for us today is what were the most progressive elements within the New Deal coalition thinking and trying to do? What was their objective? And we can talk about how they fell short. But I think there were, a couple of things that marked the vision from the progressive wing of the New Deal that we really could stand to benefit from studying today. One is empowering workers, right? They understood that the issue was one of power. And obviously unions were central to this, but in their minds, unions are valuable for raising wages and so on. But really, it was a question of power and ensuring that corporate power could be contended with by ordinary people, and organization and working class organization is a key to doing that. And another sort of related thing to that in terms of what facilitates that kind of organizing, they had a vision of taking certain basic necessities out of the realm of the market, right? The things that we all depend upon to survive shouldn't be commodified. We should have some basic security. And as many organizers know, it's easier to organize from a position of security than from a position of desperation. So I think those, that vision is really useful in thinking about what is to be done today. I'd say just kind of the second thing, quickly in closing is of course, most of this wasn't realized, right? It was maybe aspired towards, but in many ways fell short. In some ways because of issues of how the programs were designed, right? They were not always inclusive, in many cases very exclusive. Domestic and agricultural workers, for instance, who were disproportionately African American, were left out of the signature labor and employment policies. Housing policies were racialized through and through from the get-go. And also, I think it's important to note that the whole conceptualization was based on an idea of a male breadwinner, which sort of baked into the political economy of our society a very gendered division of labor. So there's these deficiencies that it had all along that we need to reckon with and be aware of as we think about what's next. But also in terms of thinking about, even for the people who were fully included, even for the people who were fully incorporated, the New Deal never realized its full vision, progressive vision of what, Franklin Roosevelt may have, sort of outlined in his economic Bill of Rights of a right to a job, right to housing, and so on, right to health. And I think the reason there, and the reason it fell short in so many ways, is because of what it was up against, right? It was up against very powerful interests who fought it tooth and nail from the get-go because it challenged the existing power structure. And that's something that we really need to be aware of right now. It's one thing that, we've got great ideas. We've got plenty of great ideas. The question is, can we build a force that's powerful enough to win what we all know we need? And I think that's really where the legacy of the New Deal is most relevant.
Gosh, I love my colleagues on this panel. This is so great. And Samir talked about earlier corporate power and contending with corporate power. And what we heard last night from the president was not only all these policy initiatives, but also fundamental to his message has been that we have to encourage workers joining unions. We have to make it easier for workers to join unions. And the fact of the matter is that, yes, the people that I represent were very much caught in the crosshairs of this crisis. We knew from the crisis after 9/11 and all the bankruptcies that followed, what happens if you don't take that moment, when you have leverage and strike with your demands, that it can get out of your hands and the corporate elite can squeeze you more than ever before. So what we did was we put forward a policy initiative that was about workers first. And we said that any government relief needed to go to keeping workers in our jobs. This was important in this moment because we had to have immediate solutions. So we didn't want to have 97% of the airline industry suddenly on the unemployment line. That's what we saw happen overnight, was 97% of the demand dropped. We likely would have seen bankruptcies and airlines go out of business and the entire industry collapse. That would have had a reverberating effect across our economy. And also the airline industry provides critical infrastructure to be able to address and attack the virus as well, moving critical ventilators and getting people the mail and their prescription drugs at home and moving critical personnel to places where they can address these issues. when those furloughs were threatened, actually, it was my members who were at the tip of the spear because the big aircraft were put on the ground first. And so while you might have 2 pilots flying that plane, you may have 13 flight attendants staffing the plane. And so who are flight attendants? Well, we're 80% women. Because of the work of our union, more and more the airlines have been hiring in a more diverse fashion. So those were the more junior flight attendants. So women and people of color were the ones who were going to be the most affected. And that's what we saw. Of course, it was a shared experience across the pandemic. But what we put forward was this Workers First package that we were able to achieve. And I want to be really clear about how we were able to achieve this. We're 80% unionized in the airline industry. And so what Chairman DeFazio, the chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, said to the corporations when they were looking for money from the government to decide how they were going to use that to save the airlines, not the people, but save the airlines. He said, you have to go through labor. I'm not talking to you until you talk to them. And so we had this moment where we had incredible leverage, and we demanded of the airlines that they come to our plan, that we were not going to be a sideshow, we were going to be the main event, that this relief could only go for pay and benefits of workers. We had to keep everyone in their jobs. There could be no diminishment to the hourly rate of pay. So we were setting the tone that this pandemic and this crisis was not going to be put on the backs of workers, that we were not going to take concessions, and we were not going to fall into a world of austerity where we were asked to just give a little bit. We've already done that. We've been there, and we didn't want to go back. But the other thing that we did was we said, you have to cap your executive compensation, ban stock buybacks and dividends. The things they would not agree to were union neutrality. So they would agree to these things that were already in place, and would agree even to a cap on their own pay, but they would not agree to staying out of union organizing so that we could gain more power. So I want to make that very clear. But this worked. This kept us in our jobs, connected to our healthcare. As long as we have employer-based healthcare, that was critically important. And it made sure that we were not having the government be the HR solution for people who no longer had jobs, so that those payroll taxes that we pay also continued through that system. We continue to support our local governments and sanitation and mass transportation and education. And we continue to pay into our Social Security system and into Medicare and into the safety nets that we need for the rest of our lives. So it was a really good plan that was designed by workers. We brought capital to the fight. We went in a unified fashion to Congress, and even under a Trump and McConnell regime, we were able to achieve that. Now, what we achieved with Chairman DeFazio in the House was also requirements for the airlines to address climate, to get to carbon neutral by 2050. That was in the House bill. And because this was hijacked in the political process and other people didn't understand necessarily the importance of that in this moment, the airlines did not have to ultimately agree to that in the end, but they had agreed to it in the House. So I think it's really important that we understand that labor organizing is a huge part of this. You can't count anyone out, because in the workplaces, we can have these discussions about the problems. We can define the problems, and then we can determine what the demands are. And the more that we have working people everywhere understand what our demands are about how we're going to create a green economy, the more that people will support that and the politics will move. So if we start in the workplace, the politics will move to a place where we can actually achieve the things that we're talking about today. And I'll stop there for now, but I just want to put a fine point on this, that this is about power. And the corporate elite have money and they have control. But if we really have the public and the working people of this country understand what our demands are, why it's important that we achieve these things, there is no reason that we cannot move the politics. And in fact, we have already done that. We heard from Lindsey Graham last week, recognizing that climate is something that we have to take on. This is the first time we've ever heard that from him. And that has been because of a lot of the work that we're talking about that has been going on during this time. So our shared experience coming out of this pandemic and the successes that we had during this time are going to lead to what we can do in addressing this climate crisis in a way that is going to rebuild our economy with equity and with labor power and with working people really controlling what we want our world to look like.
I know President Biden had a pretty critical speech last night. I think we're at 100 days, or tomorrow is 100 days. I'm not very good at math, but we're pretty much there. He just released the American Jobs Plan in the last month. And Samir, I know you've conducted an analysis of the American Jobs Plan. So I wanted to kind of start this piece of our conversation, just turning it over to you. What have you found in your analysis of the American Jobs Plan?
Yeah, I think, well, I'll say, I mean, and we just have to all, tip our hats to the extraordinary efforts that the flight attendants and others have done to ensure that these, that the CARES Act and then the rescue plan were as sort of ambitious as they were. I don't think that would have happened even under a Democratic Congress were it not for the sustained pressure from the movement. And I think that pressure and the power that, I mean, it's notable hearing Catherine, Lauren, and Sarah all say that we've been spending more time doing policy work, because it's clear that our movement is shaping policy in a much more profound way than I mean, certainly at any point in my lifetime. I mean, that's for sure. And so I would say, with the infrastructure plan generally, the president outlined the sort of the family plan, or sort of the social infrastructure piece last night, following up on maybe the physical infrastructure and the climate proposal a few weeks ago. I think it's a great start. I think it's very, very impressive compared to where we've been. And I would also say it doesn't go far enough, right? And that we need to think of it as an opportunity to move our agenda forward, and to create a platform from which we can continue to organize in the years to come. So, I mean, the key thing that I'll say about this, and I think that is what distinguishes this economic program from the last generation of economic policy, is the emphasis, sort of building on what I was saying a moment ago, on public investment. There is a recognition from the administration that's quite clear, that they're not shying away from, that the economy has been in stagnation for a long time. Certainly been, the recovery from 2008 was never particularly strong, as we all know. But even prior to that, going back decades, there's been a general sluggishness that's manifested above all in employment insecurity for working people and stagnant wages. And this is a historical problem. Investment from the capitalist class has been slowing for a long time. Capitalists invest when they see profits. And for various reasons, they have not seen tremendous profits to be made in the US. And what we know is that the areas in which we need the most investment going forward, which is caring for people, like caring for one another, caring for the elderly, caring for children, caring for people with disabilities and people who are ill, and caring for the environment, right? Those are the two areas that we need the most investment. And those are not areas that are particularly profitable to invest in. So we shouldn't expect private interests to take these crises on their own. The only way we're going to create the kinds of programs and jobs we need to address these twin crises is through public investment, and that, I will say, in a way that breaks with economic policy paradigms for the last generation, the Biden administration is clearly committed to doing. Now, the question, right, and I think this is why we need to be aware of what's going on and indeed celebrate what's going on, but be sober about it as well, is it up to the challenge of really addressing these crises over the long term? They talk about this as a one-time investment program, a once-in-a-generation investment program that they believe will kind of initiate a new plane of economic growth and private investment in the years and decades to come. I think that we need to always be fighting for greater and greater expansion of the public good. And this is a great start. This gives us like some wind at our backs to do that. But by no means can we accept this as the sort of definitive answer to the crises that the coming generations face.
But it gets to this broader question about a just transition for workers and what it's going to take to have a just transition for workers. And so I wanted to ask you that question, Sarah, of what would it take to have a just transition for workers in your industry? And also, I know, you are talking with a lot of other labor leaders, a lot of other workers. So in your discussions as well, like what would it take?
Yeah, so I really appreciate that question for a lot of reasons, and not just for the practicality of it, like what is this going to take, but recognizing that oftentimes, well, in every time, the corporate elite has won by dividing us against ourselves. Okay, so traditionally they have used racism, they have used sexism, they have used any kind of difference between workers to try to pit us against each other. I think about the pandemic during this time, and I think about our union that was formed by women, and we fought for men to have the same rights on the job as women, but we really had to fight to gain that recognition. And I think during this pandemic, we saw that there's essential work everywhere. We have been led to believe that different jobs are only worth so much because they're low skilled. The fact of the matter is that the wages are the issue, and everyone deserves a fair living wage for the work that they're doing. So I just came from the miners' strike in Alabama, and they are taking on a company that went into bankruptcy, that ripped up their contract, ripped up their pay, their pensions. Many of them have only had 4 days off in the last year. So it's all that productivity again going to the corporate elite. And miners have never seen a just transition. So when you start trying to talk with people and get between them and their jobs and start there, the conversation is dead before you start, because people are, for a couple reasons. First and foremost, people have to take care of themselves and their families. And if you're telling them that the solution means that they might not be able to do that, you're done. It's over. Secondly, people really identify with the work that they do. They take pride in that. So there has to be a respect there. There has to be a recognition there that we have to get into the communities and see what the communities need. I think it's really important for us to recognize that the mine workers, the steel workers, were some of the first people in this country to fight on environmental justice issues, because their companies were polluting the water that their children were drinking, or polluting the air that their children were breathing. And they fought back against that, and they fought for safety regulations. These are our allies. They are not opposed to us, but they have been left to believe that no one cares about them because people throw away comments like, well, get over it, coal's dead, move on, and learn to code. And all they've ever seen is a few hours of training, and then their community is decimated. And what happens when their communities get decimated? The 5 jobs that depend on those coal jobs are also decimated. So you have an entire community that is angry, that doesn't believe that public policy or politicians are looking out for them. And they are susceptible to people who are going to say, we're going to take care of you, and, screw the elite and screw the policymakers and the progressives who don't know what you deal with. That's what's in danger here. If we don't understand that we've got to take on the reality of people's jobs, meet them where they are, have those conversations in that place, join those fights, secure the pensions that are at risk because bankruptcies have occurred and all of these things have happened. And so it's really important to talk about how do you transition that work in a way that makes sense. So talk about what work can be done. What is the new work going to look like? What do you need in your community that is missing? Are there schools to be built? All of these conversations have to happen in the community, but they're not going to happen. And the kind of power that we need to generate the kind of jobs and new community that we need are not going to happen unless workers are able to actually take on these corporations, because otherwise the corporations have all the money. We know that they control our politics in many ways because corporations are people too in our democracy at this time. And they get into the rooms. What Catherine was talking about, and is different with this administration that I really appreciate, and I appreciate the tone that has been set by the president and the reverberation that is happening with his chief of staff, Ron Klain, in inviting all these different voices into the White House. The task force that was set up to talk about building union power and building unions at a cabinet level, that is not just signaling the importance that the president is giving to unions and to his statement that he wants to be the most union-friendly guy that there is. He recognizes that we have had decades of moving away what labor unions are really about. and how labor unions actually hold capital responsible and provide a check that these politicians cannot provide on their own. They're going to continue to be beholden to corporate money if we don't have a check at the ground level in those corporations with the workers who hold that corporate elite accountable. So putting together this task force and making his cabinet have to go through this process where they are prioritizing unions is putting people through an exercise, even people who have come out of the consultant world and come out of the investment banker world, through a process that they have never had to live with and do not understand. And this is critically important. So some of the work that we did on policy in the Unity Task Force to put forward policy that we're talking about now, some of the most important policy is on increasing and improving labor rights, because we're not going to have any of this sustained or change our politics to get to a place where we can actually have a just transition. What does a just transition look like? A just transition looks like transitioning people with continued pay at the rate of pay. Let's be very clear. Coal jobs can be very good paying coal jobs, very good paying jobs. So don't say, you're going to go do some other work that's going to be at half the value. You have to recognize, you have to maintain that lifestyle and that amount of pay and decide who is close to retirement, and so that you can just continue that pay and continue the security of their retirement and healthcare. And who can we talk about retraining into new jobs, but jobs that meet that same pay and those same standards. It's very important. And in the meantime, stand next to the workers who are fighting right now against these corporations. So this strike in Alabama against Warrior Met, we got to get behind those workers and stand with the United Mine Workers of America. And I want to recognize that the United Mine Workers, for the first time, have engaged in this conversation and have started to talk about what kind of demands they would put forward as a just transition that they have never seen happen before. But the fact that they're engaging in that has happened because climate justice, people have started to understand that we're never going to get there if we believe that a green economy is at odds with the labor movement. We have to do this together. We have to break through the divide and conquer that the corporate elite have used forever to keep us down and keep our demands from making progress. So it's going to take new technology, certainly in the aviation industry. We can do that. We can create greener technology, but where those jobs are shifting, in some cases to high-speed rail, then we need to make sure that we are transitioning people in a way where they are not losing their lifestyle, losing their ability to care for their families, and able to pick a job where they feel pride in doing that work.
Recent administration touting the economic growth rate has been touting the economic growth rate in the last quarter. How can we talk about the healthy economy not based on the gross national product or GNP, right? How can we talk about a healthy economy, a healthy society without necessarily tying it to growth?
Yeah, I think this is like the essential, or one of the essential questions of the 21st century, right? How do we measure success moving beyond sort of the models and frameworks of the 20th century when economic growth, unbridled economic growth was the sole metric. As we know, economic growth is a GDP growth, let's say, is an aggregate figure. It does not tell us anything about how that is affecting individuals or how it's distributed, right? How that growth is distributed, who's accruing the lion's share of that. It doesn't tell us any of that. Per capita growth doesn't do that either. And so I think, the way that we measure a decency and equity in a society is by how the proceeds are going around. Employment is one way to do that. Wage growth is one way to do that. And I think the social wage is one way to do that, to think about the economy and think about compensation and wages, not just in an individualized sense, not just in what you and I earn in our paychecks, but what is provided to all of us as a guaranteed social wage. That's the real measure of a decent society. And by social wage, I mean, again, things like the basic necessities of life being taken out of the marketplace. So we are not dependent for our survival, right? I mean, whether we're going to starve or be flung from our homes based on fluctuations in a private marketplace that are volatile, irrational, and often impossible to control. How do we ensure that everyone has basic security for the things that they need to survive outside of that? That is the measure of economic health. And I think that's the one we're going to have to try to fight for in, the coming century, really. But as we know, and as Sarah and Catherine have been pointing out, I mean, it's one, we can say that, right? But winning it, we know what needs to be done. We know exactly what needs to be done. How do we win it? Involves, building a force that can contend with the powerful interests that profit off of the way things are right now. Not just profit off of the healthcare industry itself, for instance, but profit off our dependence on employers for health insurance, yes. Right? Their ability, it's not just that insurance companies make a lot of money. It's that all employers, capital as a whole, profits off our subordination to them because of our dependence on employer-based healthcare. And expanding the social wage not only takes a lot of things out of the realm of profiteering, which should never be a profit-seeking enterprise like health care and so on, but it also empowers us. It ends this sort of grotesque subordination we have to private capital for a job so that we can have access to things that we all need.
Right. We're almost out of time, but I want to ask the same question to all of you to conclude. So my question to all of you, and I'd like to start with you, Sarah, is what do we need in a new social compact to ensure an economy for people on the planet? That's what we're here to talk about today. So Sarah, what's it going to take?
So listen, I think that we have an opportunity to follow the policy ideas that are in the Green New Deal. And it's funny because a lot of people ask me, well, why did AFA sign on as an endorser of the Green New Deal? And I said, well, we read it. And it talks about a lot of the things that Samira's talking about, that there are basic human needs that should not be commoditized. And so healthcare has to be a human right, a job guarantee, okay, so that we don't have corporations who can just hold that labor, hold that, as Catherine was talking about, the baseline of the slave system over people's heads. We also really, the only way that we are going to do this, I have to go back to this because everyone else can talk about the policies here that we have to have. But the only way that we're going to achieve them is if we break down the divides and we get into these communities and we talk with each other. I referenced the mine workers who are on strike right now. They are mining metallurgical coal, which is the basis for making steel, which we need in order to make solar panels. I saw Cristina Marquez from IBEW Local 569 in San Diego is on this call right now. And there are ideas within the labor movement and people who have skills right now that we're not hearing from and not respecting and not bringing to this conversation and engaging in this way. Catherine is talking about how that has changed, how that is improving. But the thing that we need to take away from this, as we set our demands for the kind of world that we want to build, is the only way we get there is to understand that every single person brings value to this conversation, and you can't count people out. And in the politics, you can't count out red states or red counties. We have to hold everyone accountable, and we hold people accountable by getting in and having conversations with the people who live in those communities, identifying the problems in their communities and working with them to set the demands and then having their backs to make those changes. And that is how really we're going to build the political will to get in place all of the policy ideas that are outlined in the Green New Deal. So I can't say that enough, that we can't sort of tell people what to think here. We have to stop saying people vote against themselves, because the truth of the matter is that people vote when they hear something that means something to them. And we've gotten to a place where the conversation has moved so much into the corporate realm, and labor and people are the sideshow. And we're really the main event. So building an economy that is about the people in this country and around the world, and is about building an economy where everyone gets to thrive and there's actual equity in that, those are the demands that we have to have when we build this new green economy, and treating it that way and moving ahead that way and respecting every voice is how we're going to get there.
Well, I mean, of course, agree entirely with everything Sarah just, so movingly said, and everything that Catherine was talking about the, I mean, relationship between, what we call free labor and unfree labor, and the origins of our current system, and the relationship between what we have and the past. I would say it's hard to follow, Sarah. I mean, that's but it's really really moving to hear that. I would simply say, I guess, what we've been outlining, what Catherine's talking about in terms of the just transition, what Sarah's talking about in terms of the just transition, in terms of the climate side of this, and in terms of sort of the social and the caring side of this. These are complex problems that are solvable, but require coordination, right? We need to be purposefully thinking about how to do this, and that they're not going to be magically resolved through the market responding to our needs, right? It's going to require planning, very purposeful planning, into order to ensure that people who are displaced by the disruptions that are already occurring are cared for, are given alternative opportunities, and in ways that are empowering and not alienating. And that means that we need to say very boldly and emphatically that the economy is not outside of all of us. It is not some sort of it's not determined by natural law. The economy is made by all of us. It's ours, and we ought to democratically control it, and make it what we want it to be. And that is a break from where we've been in recent decades. It's a break with how we understand capitalism, and we really, nothing short of that is gonna enable us to respond to what's to be done. And the only way we do that, as both of my co-panelists have said very eloquently, more eloquently than I could, is through our collective power.
Everyone at the table, I think Sarah was so right. And I live in a red state, and one of the things that I'm often asked about is how do I work with some of the people in this area. I've had to. So I've learned the skills necessary to survive and have conversations, and sometimes to have the hard conversations. And I've been surprised at sometimes the outcome of those conversations, and how we become allies, and we may not agree on everything. And we may not, but that happens in all relationships. We don't agree on everything. But by looking at each other as humans and starting from there, I think that we can move the needle forward. And and we have to understand that there's one planet and this is it. And we're going to have to do what's necessary so that not only we can live, but the future generations. And I do this work because I have a 5-year-old grandson. And I'm very concerned about his future. And we have to change. We have to change because we cannot keep extracting, and killing people and killing the planet. Because at the end of the day, it would mean that my grandson and the 7 generations to come will have nothing to look forward to. So it is important and emphatic that we have these kinds of conversations, but that we also work together and collaborate to find those solutions, because I think they're possible. And we can change this unequal system that exists.
Thank you, Catherine, for that. I hear our marching orders that we need to go out and have the difficult conversations. We need to organize, we need to listen to each other, and we need to fight. So I just want to thank this tremendous panel for bringing your all to this conversation today. I know I really learned a lot. I think everybody who's joined us has really enjoyed this conversation, and it's really made us think a lot about what we can do, what we are doing, and what's possible in the future. So thank you, Sarah Nelson. Thank you, Catherine Coleman Flowers. Thank you, Samir Santi, for being a part of this. Also, thank you to the Kalmanovitz Initiative for hosting this great series of conversations.